questions without notice. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The last time the parliament sat, the government waited an entire week before revealing at the last possible moment that Senator Nash would be referred to the High Court. Will the government guarantee that there are no other government members or senators where the government has sought or received advice on their constitutional qualifications to sit in parliament but not yet made these doubts about their qualifications public?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, sometimes the conduct and tactics of the opposition beg a belief. A moment ago, we just saw the grave-faced Leader of the Opposition seek indulgence, contrary to all precedent, to make a statement about North Korea. Then, Mr Speaker, came the turn for them to ask a question, which could have been about North Korea. But instead, it's asked about the matter of citizenship. Mr Speaker, as honourable members know, the High Court will be dealing with a number of citizenship matters. I think it is now 7 in total, most of which are citizenship by descent matters. I hardly think the Manager of Opposition Business has much credibility on this issue when his leader is not even prepared to demonstrate that he's renounced his own British citizenship.
The member for Petrie.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House about recent developments on the Korean Peninsula and the government's response?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you.
Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this morning I convened a meeting of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and the committee was briefed by our intelligence agency heads and defence chiefs. As honourable members will be aware, the North Korean regime has boasted of a 6th nuclear test with a seismic event of a 6.1 magnitude on the Richter scale detected underground yesterday at a North Korean nuclear test site. This is considerably larger than any previous nuclear tests. The North Korean regime claims it is a hydrogen bomb. It is certainly consistent with a thermonuclear weapon of that type, but it is not yet established whether it was in fact a hydrogen bomb. Nonetheless, this is yet another reckless and dangerous step in the conduct of this rogue regime in North Korea. Now, Mr Speaker, only last week North Korea fired a missile which travelled over Japan, over northern Japan, and landed about 800 kilometres to the east in the Pacific Ocean. I spoke shortly afterwards with the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, and offered him our strongest solidarity. And we agreed that we would, at the soonest opportunity, be meeting again with our partner in the trilateral security dialogue, the United States. We condemned that action by the North Korean regime, as we condemn today this shocking test. Now, Mr Speaker, this is the most dangerous moment in time on the Korean Peninsula since the end of the Korean War. Much is at stake. The conduct of this regime, the reckless and illegal conduct of this regime, cannot be rewarded. We have to ensure that the global community continues to impose stronger and stronger sanctions on North Korea. Mr Speaker, the nation with the greatest leverage over North Korea is China. I want to be very clear to honourable members. China finds North Korea's conduct frustrating and dismaying. China has condemned it strongly and has stated unequivocally that it will implement the latest round of Security Council sanctions, for which, of course, China voted as a permanent member of the Security Council. And so it is important to understand that North Korea is not an obedient client state of China, like East Germany was to the former Soviet Union. Nonetheless, China has the greatest leverage and hence the greatest responsibility. And so we call on China to use that economic leverage to bring this rogue regime to its senses. And, Mr Speaker, I want to acknowledge the presence today in the gallery of the Ambassador for Japan, Ambassador Kusaka. And I say to the Ambassador, as I said to his Prime Minister, that we stand in solidarity with the people of Japan, the people of South Korea, the whole global community, in standing up to this rogue regime and demanding that it come to its senses and the global community, thoroughly united, bring the strongest economic sanctions to bear to ensure that this reckless and dangerous conduct ceases.
Just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, I just point out to the House, people were drawing my attention to the clock on these matters. There is an agreement, I understand, between the sides that we can run on, and that's why the Prime Minister went on for a little over a minute more than the allotted 3 minutes. The Leader of the Opposition, I imagine, is seeking indulgence now that the matter has been raised, and I'll allow him to speak on indulgence as briefly as he can.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I would like to say to all Australians who may be watching or listening to these proceedings in Parliament that whatever disagreements might colour the next hour or so, on this question the Parliament is of one mind. Keeping our people safe is the first priority and responsibility of all who serve in the Parliament. The security of our nation and our region and the world unites this Parliament, and that is precisely as it should be. Labor unreservedly condemns North Korea's deliberate, dangerous and provocative nuclear testing. It is a regime that force-feeds its people on propaganda whilst they starve in poverty. It is a dictatorship that calls itself democratic whilst its people suffer in slave labour. It is a regime with no respect for the security of our region or the future of global peace. This latest nuclear test is a calculated demonstration of contempt. Contempt for the international community as a whole and for China and its nearest neighbours in particular. The Chinese government, who has explicitly called for these nuclear and ballistic missile programs not to proceed. Every nation must now do what we can to turn North Korea back from this incredibly dangerous path upon which it is embarked. As Secretary Mattis has said, if this goes to a military solution, it is going to be tragic on an unbelievable scale. Therefore, Mr Speaker, every nation must present North Korea with an unequivocal message. Halt your nuclear program, de-escalate your aggression and turn back from this path to conflict upon which you have embarked.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports today in the Courier Mail quoting a Nationals MP saying, "I know there are some Libs who have questions to answer about their own citizenship, I know." Will the Prime Minister now advise the House whether there are any other government members or senators where the government has sought or received advice on their constitutional qualifications to sit in the Parliament but not yet made doubts about their qualifications public?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I ask how anonymous gossip in the newspapers within the Prime Minister's area of responsibility. He's asked the first question.
The Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the House can resume his seat. To be very to the point, the first part of the question wasn't in order, but the second part of the question went to whether the government had sought advice, and that is in order, and I'll call on the Prime Minister to answer it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I've dealt with this matter on several occasions. At this stage, as honourable members are aware, 3 members of the coalition, 3 ministers, have been very candid about the fact that they believe that they have citizenship or had citizenship by descent. Those matters have been raised. They've all been referred to the High Court. Now, the advice that we have from the Solicitor General, as honourable members know, is that the High Court, we expect the High Court to find that those matters will not disqualify any of those members from sitting in the House or indeed in the Senate. Now, the honourable member asks me about other members of the House. There has been a welter of speculation about many members in the House and the Senate, including a number of members in the opposition. And the opposition including its leader, takes the view that they are under no obligation to demonstrate that they do not hold dual citizenship. That is the honourable member's question as to whether advice has been sought. The advice that I have sought from the Solicitor General is limited to the situations of the three ministers that have already been referred.
The member for Bennelong.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. On behalf of the large Korean-speaking community of Bennelong, will the Minister outline to the House the diplomatic efforts to bring the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to its senses and end its dangerous and provocative actions?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his important question. Mr Speaker, the North Korean regime continues to threaten nations in our region and to progress its illegal development of weapons that would enable it to carry out those threats. North Korea continues to directly defy the authority of the United Nations Security Council, which has repeatedly banned these illegal tests, ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. Mr Speaker, yesterday the North Korean regime conducted its sixth illegal nuclear test. As the Prime Minister said, it claimed it was a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. It claimed it now has the capability of attaching such a device to an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was exponentially more powerful than previous tests, which regrettably gives credence to the regime's claims. We are dealing with a pariah state, with a cruel and ruthless leader who has no concern for the welfare of the impoverished people of North Korea, no concern for international law and no regard for the peace and security of our region. Australia's response will continue to be firm and measured and calm. We are working with our partners and allies in the region. I am in constant contact with my counterpart foreign ministers and secretaries of state and with the United Nations to compel North Korea to reassess its calculation of risk in relation to its behaviour and to deter it from carrying out any further illegal tests. We urge all nations to fully implement the sanctions that were unanimously agreed by the UN Security Council on 5th of August. That includes banning exports of North Korean coal, lead, iron ore, seafood. It includes banning any new work visas for North Korean workers who were working outside North Korea and sending remittances back to the regime which it was using to fund these illegal programs. It also includes sanctions on North Korea's foreign trading bank, its primary source of foreign exchange. Mr Speaker, there must be unprecedented pressure brought to bear on North Korea. North Korea must understand it will pay a significant price for its illegal behaviour, and nations are urged to consider additional autonomous sanctions against North Korea, as Australia has done. Mr Speaker, we welcome the very strong stance taken by the UN Security Council, which will meet again this evening. And there will be immense consequences for our region if North Korea's illegal tests are left unchecked, and we will pursue every political, diplomatic and economic option to bring about a peaceful resolution to this crisis?
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question's to the Prime Minister. Last time this parliament sat, the Prime Minister claimed in question time, and I quote, "The Deputy Prime Minister is qualified to sit in this House, and the High Court will so hold." On what basis did the Prime Minister make this claim?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've answered this question on many occasions now, and the basis of our confidence, our very strong confidence, in the High Court holding that the Deputy Prime Minister and indeed Senators Canavan and Nash being held to be qualified to sit in the House and the Senate, that is plainly based on advice from the Solicitor General, and we hold that confidence very, very strongly. It is very strongly indeed. And look, the last thing we want to get into, perhaps, is a debate about legal opinions. But I'd say this, Mr. Speaker: there is one opinion that every Australian has, and that is the Leader of the Opposition cannot be trusted. Because the one thing we know is that he claims to have renounced his UK citizenship. Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? He won't show it. Now, Mr. Speaker, all he has to do is produce a piece of paper. That's all he's got to do. Why? What is he trying to cover up? Well, we don't know. Is it his situation or is it others? He could table it right now. We won't object. The Leader of the House, it gives me an assurance, he won't object to it being tabled. So, Mr. Speaker, whether it is on penalty rates, trading away workers' penalty rates, trading it away, what about trading them away so they've got to work for almost another week to make up for what they've lost? Mr. Speaker, the reality is the Leader of the Opposition is not fair dinkum. He's had a test. He could have put the paper on the table and everyone would know, but he's failed that test. And the question Australians are asking is, what has he got to hide?
It's the independence question. The member for Kennedy.
Minister for the Environment, crocodiles are now killing North Queenslanders at almost one a year. Sighting at our tourism beaches and attacks on dogs are almost weekly. Humans have unbalanced nature, introducing toads and protecting crocodiles. Gropers ate the baby crocodiles, gropers gone. Goannas and pythons ate the eggs, both gone. Biggest predator, my first Australian brothers, gone. Told by white fellas from far, far away that after 40,000 years they can't hunt crocs or harvest eggs. Would the minister not agree that Premier Palaszczuk ain't going to become no Cleopatra, no matter how many human sacrifices she makes to the crocodile river gods?
The Minister for the Environment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier may not be the member for Kennedy's Cleopatra, but I'm sure I'm safe in saying you're not her Mark Antony. The member for Kennedy, I can assure the member for Kennedy that we stand side by side with him in putting people before crocodiles, just like we stand side by side with the people of West Australia and putting people before sharks. And I know on our side of the House we have the original crocodile hunter and the member for Leichhardt, Mr. Speaker. The original crocodile hunter who's turned a nice pair of crocodile skins into a nice pair of boots, I understand, for two previous US presidents, Presidents Clinton and Presidents Bush. But on a more serious note, Mr. Speaker, we have expressed concern about the rise in crocodile-related fatalities. There have been 10 deaths in the last 6 years, including at places like Cape Tribulation. And clearly we have seen an increase in the number of crocodiles, particularly in areas that a human inhabited. And I know in the member's own electorate, Mareeba, where crocodiles have come into that area and should never have been allowed in that area. Now, Mr Speaker, under the federal legislation, under the EPBC Act, crocodiles are listed as a migratory species. But as the honourable member knows, it is under state legislation in Queensland where crocodiles are listed as a vulnerable species. And we call upon the Palaszczuk government to take stronger action to put people first. Now, I know that the LNP in Queensland have recently released their policy earlier this year, which we support, about removing crocodiles from marinas and other areas where there are a lot of boats or indeed people have been swimming. We support those measures. The Commonwealth stands side by side with the member for Kennedy, with the member for Leichhardt, in ensuring that the Queensland Labor government does more to put people before crocodiles.
Just before I call the member for Corangamite, could I inform the House we have present in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon Mr Grant Chapman, former South Australian Senator. On behalf of all members, a very warm welcome to you, and I call the member for Corangamite.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister update the House on the largest peacetime build-up of our military capability, a record $200 billion commitment by this government? How will this assist Australia defend itself, and how does it compare to alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. Mr Speaker, we sit in a region that we share with 7 of the world's 10 largest standing military forces and 5 of the world's declared nuclear nations, including North Korea. And so the events of the last few months, particularly the last week, remind us of how important it is that the government has embarked on the largest build-up of our military capability in our peacetime history, a $200 billion investment. And that's why we're taking this investment so very seriously, Mr Speaker. On the sea, to support the Collins-class submarines and the Anzac frigates, we have built and are building 3 air warfare destroyers, the most lethal air warfare destroyers in the world. We have also, on this side of the House, committed to building 12 offshore patrol vessels, 9 future frigates and 12 new class of submarines that will also be patrolling our waters. And the work for those projects is well underway. But, Mr Speaker, we also have room in the Integrated Investment Plan, which followed the Defence White Paper, to upgrade the air warfare destroyers to meet a range of missile threats. That upgrade of the air warfare destroyers is costed, it's in the Integrated Investment Plan, and all options for the capability of the air warfare destroyers in terms of meeting missile threats is being considered. We're also implementing a land-based surface-to-air missile defence system, which we announced earlier this year, a $2 billion investment that will be provided by Raytheon, Australia, and also CEA Technologies, an Australian radar company. It will install a surface-to-air missile defence system for our deployed forces that will intercept a range of air threats, planes, helicopters, drones, cruise missiles and rockets, Mr Speaker. So the government is not just investing in things like the Joint Strike Fighter, the Tritons, the Poseidons, the ships that I've talked about, the cyber-security capabilities. We're also investing in the kind of platforms that can protect us from the missile threats that are being talked about from North Asia. This, of course, stands in very stark contrast, Mr Speaker, to the period when Labor was in office. And they didn't, in that period of 6 years, not commission one Australian-built vessel. Not one Australian-built vessel. And they reduced spending of GDP as a percentage of defence to 1.56%, Mr Speaker, the lowest since 1938, the last year of appeasement. We will hit 2% of GDP being spent on defence by 2020, 2 years early, Mr Speaker.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since the government became aware that there was a doubt over the qualifications of the Deputy Prime Minister to be a Member of Parliament, how many executive orders, grants, delegations,
Member for Sydney,
appointments—
resume her seat. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure will cease interjecting and is warned. The member for Sydney will start a question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since the government became aware that there was doubt over the qualifications of the Deputy Prime Minister to be a Member of Parliament, how many executive orders, grants, delegations, appointments and legislative instruments has the Deputy Prime Minister signed or made?
Prime Minister has the call.
More than you.
Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. I can advise the honourable member that the government is absolutely satisfied that the Deputy Prime Minister is qualified to sit in the House. Our legal advice is very clear, and we're very confident that the High Court will confirm that when the matter is heard. So the premise of her question is false.
The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Can the minister update the House on the benefits of a well-managed national security agenda? Why are strong and consistent border protection policies important to securing our nation, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Wearing a green tie. Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Wide Bay for his hard work and his electorate. And I want to thank all Australians for the confidence that they've got in this government when it comes to border protection. We've worked hard over the course of the last several years to clean up a significant mess where 1,200 people drowned at sea when Labor lost control of our borders. There were 8,000 children put into detention and 17 new detention centres open. We've got all of those children out of detention. We have closed those detention centres and we have restored integrity to the border protection system in this country. And Mr Speaker, as the member for Wide Bay points out, the global security environment is deteriorating, and it is more important than ever that our country, like many others, keep our borders secure. And the Australian government alone must determine who enters our country, and we reassert that sovereign right today. Now, Mr Speaker, since we've stood up Operation Sovereign Borders, it's been 1,135 days since the last successful boat arrival, and we know that the people smugglers are still in business, that they still seek to take money from people to have them hop on those boats and come to our country. But it seems over the course of the last week that whilst the Leader of the Opposition has been trying to say to the Australian public that Labor Party policy is the same as the Coalition's policy, it turns out that it's not. It turns out that it's not. In fact, the statements of the Leader of the Opposition over the course of the last week, Mr Speaker, demonstrates to the people smugglers, as clearly as it demonstrates to the Australian public, that there has been no weaker leader since this Leader of the Opposition has come into his office than the former leaders in Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. It is clear that this Leader of the Opposition is as weak as Gillard and Rudd when it comes to boats, and it is clear when you see some of the statements from those members sitting behind that they have not learnt a single lesson. Not learned a single lesson since the time when they had those drownings at sea and they allowed the 50,000 people in on 800 boats. Now, the fact is, Mr Speaker, the fact is that there were people who came for medical assistance from Nauru and Manus. The arrangement was that once they had received the medical assistance and been given clearance by the doctors to go back to Nauru or Manus, or indeed back to their country of origin, they should have gone. Now, they're refusing to go, or we see one member up there screaming and interjecting wildly. He's obviously representing many others on the left of the party here, Mr Speaker, who would undo the policy that has been successful in stopping boats. So at a time, Mr Speaker, when the Australian public is watching what is happening in the national security space in this country, it is demonstrated on a daily basis that the Leader of the Opposition simply is not up to the task, and if he was elected at the next election, we would see the boats recommence under Labor as they did in the past.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Leader of the House said, and I quote, "The Constitution, of course, allows a person to be a minister for 3 months after they've been deemed not to be eligible. Is it seriously government policy that ministers will keep their jobs for 3 months after being disqualified by the High Court?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the question is entirely hypothetical. As you have said before, the member for New England is entitled to be the member for New England in the House until the High Court rules otherwise. As a consequence, these fishing expedition hypothetical questions should be ruled out of order.
The Manager of Opposition Business. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The question asks what the government policy is. If there's no government policy, you can say there's no government policy, but the question asks what's the government policy.
I'll point out, well, if the Leader of the House ceases interjecting, I can come to his point of order. I'll just point out to the Leader of the House, I haven't made comments about eligibility. I've pointed out that to the extent that I have constitutional responsibilities, they don't relate at all to the matter of eligibility. They relate to swearing members in and other matters. Now, the question did ask whether it was government policy, and on that basis, I think, whilst the Leader of the House could point out that he thinks it offends the standing orders, there have been many questions asked about government policy, about whether the government has a particular policy or in a different circumstance it would adopt a different policy. So I'm going to allow the question and I'll call the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this is another far-fetched hypothetical question we get from the opposition, which stated over the last few days that its object this week was to create chaos in the House of Representatives. That was what they wanted to do. They wanted to do it this week. At a time when we face the gravest threat to peace on the Korean Peninsula, at a time at home when we have Australian families and businesses bearing the brunt of higher and higher electricity prices, at a time when the Labor Party has finally made the stunning admission that it was their complacency, their neglect, their willful recklessness that resulted in there being a shortage of gas on the east coast of Australia, when, in other words, Mr Speaker, they put their hands up and said they were guilty of the high electricity prices we're currently facing and tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs being put at risk. At the time of all of that, the Labor Party's goal is to try to create chaos, mayhem. We're going to, as they threatened, they were going to create disorder in the House. At one point they said they were going to walk out. Mr Speaker, the Australian people expect this House, this Parliament, to focus on their security, their national security, their energy security, securing their jobs and the opportunities for the future. That's what the government is focused on, and I know the opposition has no interest in taking advice from me, but I would counsel them to focus on the same real issues themselves.
The member for Brisbane.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the news reported in recent economic data releases? How does this data point to better days ahead for all Australians and for the constituents in my electorate of Brisbane?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Brisbane for bringing the attention to the matters of the economy and people's jobs, the things that people and Australians are concerned about. And, Mr Speaker, I am very pleased to report, both to the Parliament and, of course, to the member for Brisbane, as an economist himself and as the member for Brisbane concerned about jobs in his own electorate, that there is further good news about the economy, which has been released in the economic data even as of today. Over 181,000 job advertisements were recorded in August. More jobs, Mr Speaker. That is the highest level in over 6.5 years of the number of job advertisements are out there today, Mr Speaker. And we know that in the last fiscal year there are over 240,000 jobs created,
of 240,000, and in the last 6 months to the end of July, that was the strongest 6 months jobs growth in full-time employment in almost 40 years, Mr Speaker. In almost 40 years. More jobs is what the positive economic data is revealing. But I can say also today, Mr Speaker, in figures released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that the amount of wages and salaries earned by Australians in the June quarter rose by 1.2%. 1.2% in just one quarter, Mr Speaker, and that is the fastest pace of increase since late 2013. So more wages as well as more jobs, Mr Speaker. More money in the pockets of Australians because more Australians are getting more work, Mr Speaker. But there's also been more investment. Last week's capital expenditure survey showed that non-mining related capex rose 2.6% in the June quarter, and the estimates for 17-18 are up 5%, Mr Speaker, up 5%. That is an increase in non-mining investment in our economy, and it comes on the back of the strong pro-investment, pro-growth, pro-job policies of the Turnbull government, Mr Speaker. We also see surveys of manufacturing activity showing that the highest level of rises in manufacturing activity from that survey in 15 years. And on top of that, we have business conditions as surveyed in the business community at their highest levels, Mr Speaker, in almost a decade. And so what we have is the National Economic Plan that is driving jobs in this country, Mr Speaker, producing those jobs and producing that growth. We have a Turnbull government that's focused on the economics of opportunity, not the politics of envy, Mr Speaker, by the most left-wing Labor Party leader we've seen in generations, whose only policy he believes to encourage growth in this country is to tax it into oblivion.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government knowingly putting at risk every ministerial decision and every ministerial action being taken by ministers who have responsibility for regional development, regional communications, local government, resources, territories, agriculture, water resources and Northern Australia? How can the Prime Minister act so recklessly on the arrogant basis that he knows what the High Court will so hold?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, over the last 2 weeks, all we've heard from the opposition is their plans to create trouble and chaos, so they've said, in the House of Representatives. Oh yes, you all have. You all have. That's what you've all said to do. You've all said to do that.
The member for
Try to create chaos in the Parliament. We've read it every day. Every day we've read about your cunning plans to create mayhem in the House of Representatives. We haven't heard anything about the first ever national strategy to protect Australians from terrorism in crowded places. We haven't heard anything from the Labor Party at that. That's what we've set out. We haven't heard any support at all for our drug testing trials. We believe welfare money should not be spent on drugs and alcohol. So do most Australians, and so does anybody that cares about somebody who is in the grip of alcoholism or substance abuse. But the Labor Party won't support us on that. We've heard snide remarks and backtracking and hedging on the cashless welfare card, which has meant that in the communities where it is operated to date, we have seen a dramatic reduction in alcohol abuse, in substance abuse, in domestic violence, in public violence.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his? The Prime Minister's concluded his remarks. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended, as would necessary to be moved for the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion forthwith: that the House calls on the Prime Minister to immediately stand aside the Deputy Prime Minister from Cabinet until his constitutional qualifications have been determined by the High Court.
We won't overreach.
Speaker, this motion deals with one question and one question only. This Speaker deals with whether or not this Prime Minister is—
The Leader of the House has the call.
We no longer heard, Mr.
The Leader of the House has moved the Manager of Opposition business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the Manager of Opposition business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Murray tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Morton and Lawler tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 73. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion, Mr Speaker.
Member for Hunter has
we
the floor.
cannot expect people to have respect for this parliament if this parliament's
Member
not
for Hunter
prepared to
resumes
respect
seat.
the...
The Leader of the House has the call.
He hasn't got his heart in it, Mr Speaker. I move that he be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the member for Hunter be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. It would be helpful if members were to remain in their seats during this successive division, unless they're leaving the chamber or they did not vote or they are changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is that the member for Hunter be no further heard. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 73. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. They'll be for different sides, though. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. On this occasion I appoint the honourable members for Morton and Lawler tellers for the ayes and the honourable members for Murray and Gray tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 73, no 74. The question is therefore negatived.
That's our majority. Yeah.
Members could just resume their seats as quickly as we can so that we can resume question time. The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on the action the government is taking to put downward pressure on energy prices, as this is of great concern to local residents in Gilmore? Is the minister aware of any differences in policy proposals that would ultimately hit the family budget for all Australians?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Gilmore for her question, her deep concern about large employers in her electorate, like Nowra Chemicals, like Manildra, who are dealing with higher electricity prices. Now, the Turnbull government has been taking action on all fronts to put downward pressure on prices. We've been reining in the power of the poles and wires companies, and if the Labor Party did it, consumers would be $6.5 billion better off, Mr Speaker. When it comes to the retailers, we've got significant commitments from them to provide more information, better information, comparable information to consumers. And we're putting in place a mechanism to be able to restrict gas exports to ensure we have more gas for domestic supply. And we know that more gas we produce has put upward pressure on gas prices. And do you know who was in government when the decisions were taken to make these big exports of gas? It was the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition was a senior minister. Now, the member for Port Adelaide was asked about what did they know and when, and he said he didn't know anything. He told insiders we didn't know anything. But you only have to go to the 2012 Energy White Paper, when Labor was in office, which I said, and I quote, about increasing gas exports. It will lead to, quote, tighter supply and higher prices, Mr Speaker. So you can imagine the great interest I had in the interview that the member for Port Adelaide now would rather forget with David Spears last Thursday. And normally you will get those interviews sent out to you on email by the member's office. But it didn't come on Thursday, it didn't come on Friday, it didn't come on Saturday, it didn't come on Sunday, it hasn't even come today, Mr Speaker. It hasn't even come today. Now, you know why? You know why? Because there was a question in there, Mr Speaker, from David Spears, who said to the member for Port Adelaide, your own white paper told you there would be an impact on prices, but you said you weren't warned. This is what the member for Port Adelaide said. Everyone knew there was going to be an impact on prices, Mr Speaker. Everybody knew. So, Mr Speaker, here is the Labor Party and a Leader of the Opposition who said they stand up for blue-collar workers. But through their actions, gas prices have increased, electricity prices have increased, and the jobs of people in manufacturing, in plastics, in paper, in chemicals, in cafes, in pubs are all now put in jeopardy because the Labor Party, in order to win Green votes, have given away the blue-collar workers that you should be standing up for.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed in the notice.